All right, y'all, this one here's Friends to the End. John Boyer and Ted Clara had grown up next door to each other. Now, two closer friends couldn't be found. They walked to school together every morning and home together every afternoon. Now, when someone picked on one, he was sure to hear from the other. They were also hired together in the coal mines the same day and worked side by side. 3 years later, Ted got married. John felt that their lifelong togetherness would be broken now that Ted was married, but it wasn't so. Nearly every night of the week, he would be over at Ted's place playing cards with the couple. The whole town was shocked when Ted and John had a falling out, evidently over Ted's wife. Ted accused John of seeing her when he wasn't around. Even though they weren't speaking to each other, they still worked side by side in the mines. One cold February morning, while working together as usual, their silence was broken by bitter words. John told Ted he wasn't going to work with a jealous fool. When he started to walk out of the mines, he heard a loud rumble and turned just in time to see the roof falling on Ted. As he hurried back to help, a piece of slate fell on him, pinning his chest to the ground. But Ted rushed over and was able to lift it off. John still couldn't move because his ribs were crushed. He remained there in agony until some other miners came to rescue him. When he told them what had happened, all the miners turned to one another in amazement. They knew Ted was lying dead under 30 tons of rock and couldn't have pulled the slate off of John. All right, this one here's The Invisible Friend. Now, Charles Peterman had worked for 10 years in the mines and had never had an accident. Now, during his early mining days, he had worked with Joseph Staunton for 9 weeks, and in that time, they had become good friends. Now, one day, while Charles and Joseph were working deep in the mines, they heard a cracking sound, as if the timbers were breaking. Then, the place started to fall in on the workers. In a quick decision, Joseph grabbed the nearest timber and held on to it to keep it from falling. Now, in doing this, he enabled Charles to escape. And 2 days later, they found the body of Joseph Staunton. He had been crushed by the mine fall. After that accident, Charles had been in numerous mine falls, but he had never been hurt by any of them. One time, the timbers right above his head began to fall, but as if by a miracle, they stopped in midair until he was clear of the danger. When Charles was asked why the timbers had stopped and had not fallen on him, he replied, "I could see Joseph holding them and motioning me towards safety." The workers could not believe this. But then one day, the same thing happened again. No matter what Charles did or what kind of danger prevailed, he was never hurt or even scratched. Every time the workers saw Charles saved, they asked him how he had done it. He would always say that he could see Joseph holding up the supports to save his life. Charles finally retired from the mines, but to this day, the story still goes that a ghost saved his life numerous times. Now, this one here is called 80 Feet Deep. In the days when mining first began, a man would have to work 14 hours a day in order to feed his family. After a week of such long, hard labor on Saturday nights, most of the single men would go to town to visit the local saloon. Now, Fred Vincent went to town one Saturday night, not to go to the saloon, but to get groceries for the following week. He had had an argument over a saloon girl that day with a fellow worker, and to keep out of trouble, he felt he should get his shopping done as quickly as possible and just return home. As he was coming out of the store, he heard someone call his name from the shadows. He walked slowly to the corner of the building and saw Bill Sloan, the man with whom he had argued earlier that day. Suddenly, like a bull charging toward Red, Sloan lunged with full force, a shiny blade in his hand. Fred tried to disarm his attacker, but as he did so, the knife slipped and Sloan slowly fell to the ground. His face filled with hate and pain, In his last moments of life, he told Fred, "You'll never be able to forget me. I'll see to that." Fred panicked. Since he and Bill had argued that day, he was afraid no one would believe that Sloan had called him to the shadows and that his death was accidental. He picked up the limp body and carried it to the mine shaft. That had been closed down because of its danger. After placing the body several hundred yards back in the mine, he loosened the prop and ran, leaving only in time to see the entire mine collapse. Now, 2 weeks later, when everyone had given up the search for the lost miner, Fred felt that the matter was closed. Now, one brisk fall evening, as Fred was coming home from the mines, he heard someone call his name. Then he heard the sentence, "I'll never let you forget." His blood chilled and he stopped still. But only the leaves falling slowly, softly, gently to the ground made another sound. He walked to his cabin in silence, wondering who or what he had heard. Now, about 2 months had gone by, and Fred kept thinking of Sloan's dying words. One night, about 8:30, he seemed particularly restless as he worked in the mine, perhaps because they were deeper in the mine than they had ever gone. But suddenly his lamp went out, and as it did, another one lit beyond him. But how could that be? No one had ever been any further than he. Nothing was there but rock. Fred felt a breeze, and at the same moment, a man spoke his name. He turned to run and saw that the men behind him had gone home for the night. He then saw a man who looked like Bill Sloan. The man walked up to him, and Fred saw that a knife was sticking in his stomach. The man was Bill Sloan, and he said, "You'll never forget me." When the men returned the next day, they found Fred with a piece of glass in his stomach and his shattered lamp lying beside him. They felt that his death was accidental, but was it? Was it really? All right, y'all, this one's called The Swinging Lantern. Now, during the early 1850s, when the railroads were coming into North Carolina, a strange event occurred which has never been fully explained. A conductor on a Southern Railroad express train was signaling for the engineer to start the train. When, as it began to move, he slipped and fell to the tracks. He was killed instantly, of course. Now, the next day, the conductor's body was buried without his head, for it had been cut off by the train wheels and could not be found. The head was never found, and the incident was finally forgotten. Now, months later, the ghost of the conductor reappeared. Night after night, the citizens of Wrightsville saw a lantern, or at least what appeared to be a lantern, swinging from side to side as it came down the tracks. Now, the people demanded an explanation of this strange phenomenon, and the mayor summoned several experts from all over the United States. This group of scientists stayed at a site beside the tracks for 3 days, waiting for the lantern to appear. They were about to give up when finally the light came swinging down the tracks within about 3 yards of the men and suddenly darted toward the woods. The next morning, the scientists wrote up individual reports. The final conclusion was drawn up and published in the Wrightsville Beach newspaper. This swinging light defies all the scientific knowledge of our time, and it cannot be said that the light does not exist. To the people of Wrightsville, there is only one explanation possible. The conductor, who was buried over 100 years ago, is still searching for his head and carries the same lantern he used on the old Southern Express. All right, y'all, this one here is called Van Meter's Plight. Now, George Van Meter's small farm was in Dorcas Hollow, just 5 miles south of the present site of Petersburg, West Virginia. George was a carpenter from Germany. He had settled with his family at Dorcas when there were only 15 families in the whole county. At that time, the Huron Indians were rampaging throughout the whole valley. Some of the early settlers had already been killed in Indian raids. George was one of the many isolated farmers whose cabins were a good way from the settlement. Now, on the morning of July 4th, while most of the settlement was preparing for the coming celebration, George Van Meter was in a small field near his cabin. His son was helping him while the rest of the family was getting ready to leave for the big day at the settlement. Now, George and young David had just stopped for a much needed rest when a small band of Indians came running out of the woods across the field. The father told his son to run for the cabin and take the others to the settlement. He would try to fight off the band long enough for the boy to get the family to safety. That was the last time any of George's family was to see him alive. Young David Van Meter made it to the settlement with the rest of the family and warned the townfolk. A group of men accompanied by David left to rescue George. When they reached the farm, a sickening sight met their eyes. The ox George was plowing with had been killed, and the cabin had been burned to the ground. Only the chimneys that had stood at each end of the cabin were left. George's body was found a few feet from the cabin he had given his life for. His head had been completely severed from his body. Although the men searched the farm the rest of the day and into the night, they did not find the head. The next day, the whole settlement prepared for an Indian attack. The Indians never showed up at the settlement, but George Van Meter's head did. On the day after the raid, a small boy found a cooking pot on the steps of the meeting house cabin. When the pot was opened before the settlers' eyes, George's face was staring at them. The Indians had boiled his head in the pot, a most horrifying sight to behold. For years after the event, no one would go near the Van Meter place. There was a reason for this. Some people said that on several occasions a headless body had been seen wandering about the old ruins as if it were searching for something. Was it possible that George could have been coming back, searching for his ill-fated head? Today, the two chimneys can still be seen from Route 28 out of Petersburg. Most people pass the site, never realizing the story that lies behind those chimneys. All right, y'all, this one here is called The Old Man's Reward. One night, an old man went to a farmer's house and asked to stay there overnight. He was told he could sleep there, provided he would go out to the little haunted house in the backyard. The farmer promised to give him a bag of money if he would stay in the little house until morning. The stranger went to the house and got ready for bed, but before retiring, he sat on the floor and began reading his Bible. He heard something rolling and went out to investigate, but found nothing. He began reading again and heard something skating. He investigated again, but found nothing. These noises went on until early in the morning. A knock sounded on the old man's door, and on opening it, he found a headless man standing there with a hatchet in his hand. The headless man took him by the hand, led him down the stairs to a little door at the end of the hall. He took the hatchet, knocked the door in, pulled out a bag of money, and handed it to the stranger. Then he disappeared. The old man had received his reward for staying all night in the old Simpson place. All right, y'all, this one here's called The Headless Man. Many years ago, the people of a certain town had to pass a cemetery on their way to a little church up on the hill. Now, several people told of seeing a headless man who appeared in the distance before them. No one had had the courage to speak to the man, to ask him why he was there or what he wanted. At dusk one evening, a young man was passing the cemetery, and suddenly the headless man appeared in front of him. Although he was startled by the appearance of such a thing, the young man got up enough courage to speak. He asked him why he was there and what he wanted. After hearing the reply to his questions, the horrified young man went on home. The next day, some of the townspeople who had heard of the episode went to the young man's house to find out what the headless man had said to him. After they knocked several times, the young man appeared at the door. The townspeople looked at him with astonishment. He no longer appeared young and handsome as he had been before. His hair was white, his skin looked old and wrinkled, and there was a strange, glassy look in his eyes. When the townspeople asked him what had happened, he only nodded his head and went back into the house, closing the door behind him. No one ever found out what the headless man said to him. All right, y'all, this one here is called Dog Rock. Now, Clem Robinson lived at the head of Robinson Hollow, which was named after him. He was a man with a very violent temper. It is said that when he became angry at something, he would beat it to death or tear it apart, no matter what it might be. So it was with one of his foxhounds. One night, Clem was fox hunting in Robinson Hollow, and one of his hounds scented a rabbit's trail and began to follow it. Now, as the dog chased the rabbit, Clem became very angry. He tried to call the dog back, but it paid no attention to him. This enraged him, and when the dog did return to him, he was so angry that he picked up a log and beat the animal's head off. After he had done this to the dog, it ran and rolled down the hill and into the creek. The creek is lined on both sides by very steep and rocky hills. It has been told that at night, people have seen a headless dog running down one side of the hill, across the creek, and up the other side of the hill. Clem also saw the headless ghost of his foxhound as he returned home one night. After seeing the ghost of his dog, he changed his ways and did not show such brutality toward his animals. All right, y'all, this one here is the headless dog of Tug Fork. Now, a schoolhouse used to stand on a little rise near the road leading from Mill Creek to Tug Fork. The house had been gone for many years when people living in the settlement near there began to speak of seeing the headless dog that came out of the heap of stones on the site of the old chimney. The cause of the ghost dog's appearance there has never been explained, but some people hint that long ago, when the country was thinly settled and people were not very inquisitive concerning one another's doings, a traveler and his dog were killed by robbers and buried under the schoolhouse. There are several persons living in Mill Creek who remember hearing reliable people tell of seeing the spectral dog and even of being followed by it. One man was traveling the road on horseback after dark, just as he rounded the bend where the old schoolhouse had stood. He plainly saw by the light of the full moon a large black dog coming down the bank from the chimney place. It came into the road and followed him. Having heard of the creature before, the traveler put spurs to his horse and rode rapidly away from the gloomy place. But the dog bounded after him swiftly, and actually leaped on the horse's back behind the frightened man. Now, casting a glance backward, he saw the ghastly creature sitting calmly behind him, its bloody neck from which the head was missing, almost touching him. The horse apparently was not aware of the horrid specter, but the man certainly was, although he dared not look behind him the second time until he had reached a settlement several miles away, whereupon he found the dog had vanished. Now, one night, nearly 30 years ago, 3 young men were walking home from a meeting on Tug Fork. Their way homeward led past the haunted house site. Probably they had all heard tales about the headless dog and regarding them as made-up stories. They passed the heap of stones on the rise above the road, where they saw nothing unusual by the light of the brightly shining moon. But some distance beyond there, one of the young fellows looked back and noticed a large black dog following closely behind them. He called the attention of the others to the animal, and they stopped to observe it more closely. Their observation convinced them that it was the headless dog and that it cast no shadow on the ground where it walked in the bright moonlight. Without saying much, the young men traveled as rapidly as possible the rest of the way home. But the dog still followed them and even went ahead, gamboling and rolling at their feet. One youth struck at it with a cane, but the cane went through the specter as though it were a shadow and stuck in the road. After this, the young men broke into a run, the dog keeping close to them until they reached a creek. Here, the dog turned back, evidently very reluctant to do so, as it could be seen in the moonlight to stop now and then and turn in the direction of the terrified youths, who lost no time in widening the distance between themselves and the horrible specter. All right, everybody, this one here is the legend of the haunted house. On a hill in Harrison County stands an old abandoned house. It is a pretty white house with a large yard, and in the summer it is surrounded by many kinds of flowers. This house has been empty for a little over a year. It is not a spooky looking place that everyone would be afraid of, but for some reason, none of the families who have bought it have lived there more than a month, in spite of its beautiful location. Now, some people believe the house is haunted, but this legend was probably strengthened on one rainy night when Lee Harris, a traveling salesman, was passing through that section. He had a flat tire just down the road from the house. Seeing a light in the window, he decided to ask the people who lived there if he could use their telephone to call a repair station. Now, a very beautiful woman opened the door. Her hair was golden blonde and waved down her back. Her eyes were as blue as the sky on a bright spring day. Indeed, the man was enchanted by her many charms. She was joined at the door by 3 small children, bright-eyed and much like their mother. The salesman called a repair shop and found that a bridge had been washed away and no one could come to fix the tire until the next morning. Now, when Lee explained where he was, the man did not believe that a woman and 3 children were in the house. He told the salesman to get away from the place as soon as possible, to sleep in his car if he had to. Lee could not understand this because the woman treated him so nicely. She offered him a cup of coffee and told him he could spend the night in her house, and he accepted her hospitality. He had a very comfortable night until about 12:30, when he heard the children screaming. At first he thought they were having youthful nightmares and would soon go back to sleep, but the screaming persisted, and he decided the woman could use some help in getting the youngsters quieted. When he got downstairs, he was amazed at what he saw. It was the same beautiful woman he had encountered just a few hours before, but she looked entirely different. Thin, rough, and almost ugly. Her once beautiful bright eyes were darkened and glassy with a look of torture. The children, now wearing ragged clothing, were not even clean, and they were crying from hunger. Lee spoke to the woman and asked her why she didn't feed the youngsters, but she only kept on screaming at them and begging them not to cry, as though she hadn't heard him speak to her at all. He walked over and touched her arm, trying to keep her from the children. When he touched her flesh, he found it was cold, as if in death. Could it be that all of them were dead? Lee used all his strength in trying to keep her from harming her offspring, but nothing he did seemed to stop her. Finally, she led the little ones out the back door. Lee followed them, sorry for the children and curious. He saw the woman line them up according to their ages. She took the smallest, who was about 2 years old, and led him by the neck to the well. Lee rushed to her, but it was too late. She had murdered the little boy, once bright-eyed and happy. Lee turned to the other children, but with all his power, he could not move them from their positions. The woman took the next child, who was about 4, and proceeded to do the same with her. The 5-year-old was next, and after this, she knelt by the well and began praying to God to look after her beautiful children. She did love them so, but she had no money and could not bear to see them tortured by starvation. The woman then rushed into the house and cut her wrists. She died on the kitchen floor. Lee went upstairs to get a blanket to lay over her, but when he returned, the body had disappeared. He looked everywhere, but it was gone. There was only the stillness of the early morning and the sun coming through the window. When the man from the service station finally came that morning, he was surprised to find Lee in the house. He said the house was haunted, that everyone who moved into it heard the voices of children screaming as though they were in pain. Lee asked about the lovely woman, but the repairman didn't seem to know anything about any woman living in the house with 3 children. So Lee did not tell the man about what he had seen, but he felt he had learned the real story behind the haunted house. And perhaps he had. All right, everybody, this one here is called The Man on the Railroad. It was a cool summer night as my great-grandfather sat on his back porch overlooking the railroad tracks. Little did he know he was about to see the town ghost, the man on the railroad. My great-grandfather had moved to Collier's, West Virginia, just 2 weeks before. As he sat on the back porch of his new home this particular night, he noticed an old man walking on the railroad tracks. He did not think this was strange, since hobos often waited to jump the train, but this man tonight was different. As grandfather observed him, the hobo kept taking a drink of something out of a bottle. After a while, he sat down on the tracks and kept drinking from the bottle. It was obvious that the man was a drunk and soon would be insensible. If he were aware of what was going on, even now, he would move away from the tracks because the 9:15 freight train was due in 5 minutes. But the man sat there without moving an inch, and he continued drinking from the same bottle, which, it seemed, would never run dry. At this point, my great-grandfather was getting a little worried. My great-grandmother had joined him on the porch, and she too was aware of the scheduled train. She urged her husband to go and help the man. Now, the tracks were about a fourth of a mile from the house, and my great-grandfather started to run down in the direction of the man. He had only about 4 minutes to reach him. He ran faster, and in the distance, he heard the train's warning whistle. Would he be able to reach the man in time? He told himself he had to. He began to shout, "You fool, get out of there before you're killed." But the man paid no attention whatever to the warning. Now, great-grandfather heard the train drawing nearer. He knew it would soon reach the spot where the man was sitting. Since the engine was so high, the engineer would not be able to see him and would not bring the train to a stop. It was already too late. The train was right there, and a horrible death was about to occur before my great-grandfather's eyes. But much to his amazement, before the engine struck the man, the old hobo had disappeared into thin air. At first, my great-grandfather thought he was seeing things and waited for the train to pass to prove to himself that someone had really been sitting there. However, there was no trace of anyone. He was positive he had seen a man. His wife had seen him too, for she had suggested that he go down and help him, but now he was gone. Great-grandfather returned home quite shaken up and told his wife what had happened, although she had watched the scene herself. They both were disturbed over the matter and decided to keep it a secret. Now, after about a week, the mystery troubled them so much that they told their landlord about the strange night. Expecting to be called silly or crazy as they revealed their story, they were surprised when the landlord instead listened intently with a serious look on his face. When my great-grandfather finished his story, the landlord began to explain what the two had seen. A long time before, an old man whom no one had ever seen before appeared in the town. Being wary of strangers, the people refused to give him food, shelter, or even a job. The stranger got drunk, and for the good of the town, he was driven away. The only thing the stranger knew how to do was jump trains, and so he sat down on the tracks, waiting for the next freight. When the train came, the man on the railroad was mangled to pieces. Every year, at the time of his death, this man would return and wait for the train. Whenever people would try to ride past the tracks on the anniversary of his death, the horses would buck and go no further. No one had ever succeeded in getting past the tracks on this particular date. Now, my great-grandfather was the only one ever to go near them on that strange night. He thought he saw a man in trouble and tried to help him. Now, a year after the incident, my great-grandfather waited to see the man on the railroad appear again. It was 9:10, 5 more minutes, and the train would pass. There was no sign of the hobo. At last, the train passed and no man appeared. No one has seen the man on the railroad since. Some people believe that great-grandfather satisfied what the ghost had waited for all these years. A person with a human heart to help someone in need. All right, everybody, this one here is called The Girl in the Green Coat. Now, driving home one afternoon, a man saw a little girl suddenly appear in front of his car. He slammed on his brakes and turned the steering wheel, trying to miss the child. but it was too late. He could feel a thump against the car as it hit her body. The frightened man ran to a nearby house. After he had knocked several times, a woman finally appeared. He told her that he had just hit a little girl and asked if he could use her telephone to call an ambulance. Now, the woman asked him if the girl was wearing a green coat and a red scarf. The man nodded. He would not need to call an ambulance, the woman said. The child was her little girl, but she had been dead over 5 years. Her daughter had been hit by a car at the very spot on which his car was sitting, and she had been wearing a green coat and a red scarf at the time. The man looked at her in astonishment. The woman went on to explain that several times before, someone had been driving along and suddenly seen a little girl wearing a green coat and a red scarf jump in front of the car. Hardly able to believe the story, the man walked back to his car. When he looked at the road in front of his car, the girl was gone. All right, y'all, this one here is called The Blue Gown. Many years ago, in the vicinity of Clarksburg, a young lad of 12 had to run an errand late at night. The family lived in a large 2-story house on top of a hill that sloped down to a gully leading to the river, which was about half a mile away. As the boy was hurrying home that cold November evening, something caught his eye. There, in the freezing temperature, a woman went walking by him. She was dressed in a blue evening gown of flowing chiffon, and she didn't seem to notice either the boy or the cold. She was walking down the hill, and the boy decided to follow her. He called out to her several times, but she did not seem to hear. She just kept on walking, her gown flowing in the brisk air. He noticed that she was barefooted in spite of the cold night and the evening dress she wore. Now the boy followed her along the gully that led straight to the river. Finally, she came to the river's edge, and without stopping, she gently walked into the icy water until she disappeared. He waited for her to return, but she did not. After waiting for what seemed an hour, he couldn't stand the cold any longer and went back home. He tried to sleep, but couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He told his family about it the next day, but no one believed him. After everyone had half convinced him that he must have been dreaming or sleepwalking, his little brother came running into the house with a piece of blue chiffon he had found on the path the boy had taken the night before. All right, this one here is called Returning Suicide. Now, in the 1920s, there was an old white house near Monongah that was said to be haunted. Now, it was a large house, and a woman in white was supposed to have jumped to her death from a window of one of the upstairs bedrooms. Now, Faith Harris was a young woman when her family bought the house and moved in against the warnings of the people who lived nearby. They said no one had been able to live in the house any length of time since the woman's death, and the last family who lived there had moved out after only a week. Now, since the suicide, no one had slept in the room from which the woman had leaped, but it was said that she haunted that part of the house and made nightly visits there. Now, people claimed to have seen her walking the grounds in her white dress. Faith wouldn't believe such stories and took the bedroom as her own. Preparing for bed the first night, she raised the window, and as she did, she saw a white figure walking slowly up the path towards the house. She laughed to herself, thinking it must be one of the family coming home, and went to bed. The next morning, when she did not come downstairs for breakfast, and everyone had called her several times. Her sister went up to get her. When she entered the room, there was Faith, lying half on and half off the bed, her face beaten black and blue, and her body bruised all over. The room was a shamble. Now, when she was able to talk, Faith told of the voice she had heard as she lay between sleeping and waking the night before. Someone was shaking her and saying, "Get up, get out, here, take it, it's money." Thinking it was one of her sisters playing a practical joke, she sleepily pushed the hands away and said, "Oh, get away, let me sleep." And the next thing she knew, she felt a terrible pain and then another on her face again and again until nothing seemed to matter except sleep and unconsciousness. All right, y'all, this one here is called The Old Gray Mare Conquers the Unknown. Now, Block Stanley was a sturdy man, as his name implied. He built his life on the motto that all work and no play was the only way to build a good farm. His one weakness was the love of coon hunting. His greatest pleasure was to take his mare, Old Nellie, and his dogs out at night to tree a coon. No one else would take a horse on a coon hunt, but Block was by no means an ordinary man. One night in the late fall, when the bare trees lifted their black branches toward the yellow moon, he decided to join a few neighbors in their favorite pastime. Joined in the companionship of drink and good humor, they sat around the campfire until dawn. Now, as the first light of dawn crept over the hill, the dogs jumped a coon. Now, they cornered it in the field adjoining the Madison graveyard. Now, the condition of this field had long aroused speculation. No one grazed cattle or mowed the field, and yet it was always green and looked as if the grass had been freshly cut. Although Block was aware of certain tales about the field told by the superstitious townspeople, he disregarded them with the aplomb of an individualist. He was convinced that there was some logical explanation. Now, while the others stood in indecision, Block went into the field after the coon. Suddenly, the men heard a scream and observed Block suspended in the air without visible means of support. As immobile as statues, the men remained in fixed positions, and Block called to his old mare for help. The horse that he had left standing nearby went to him without hesitation. Grabbing hold of the saddle, he ordered her to get him out of that field. It was as if dozens of people were holding him back. The mare pulled with all her might, and yet was barely able to move him. Finally, after struggling for about 200 feet, Block suddenly dropped to the ground. He lay prone as a cold breeze rippled through the tattered shreds of his shirt and trousers. The stunned and speechless men helped him back to the flickering fire. Afraid to venture forth without the safety of daylight, they sat until the pink dawn erased all shadows. Now, looking for an explanation, the men went into the field to see if there had been barbed wire that could have grabbed or held him in such a manner, but there was absolutely nothing. Block swore that something or someone had tried to pull him into the great unknown. Needless to say, he never went hunting near the cemetery ever again.